Glass shatters across marble floors as a woman in an emerald evening gown backs away from the man she thought she knew. There's a moment when your life splits in two, before the truth and after. For 15 years, I built a perfect facade, the successful designer, the supportive wife, the woman who had it all. Then I heard my husband's voice through a half-open door on my 40th birthday, planning to leave me with nothing. They say Chicago was built twice, once from the ashes of the Great Fire, and again on the foundations of secrets and power. I never thought I'd have to rebuild my life the same way. When you discover everything you believed was a lie, you have two choices, crumble or rise. They expected me to disappear quietly. They never expected me to fight back. Some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep. And some fires, once started, can never be contained. Catherine Adler stood frozen in the doorway of her husband's study, the crystal champagne flute cold against her palm. Through the half-open door, she could see Richard, her partner of 15 years, hunched over his mahogany desk with Natalie Winters, his new legal assistant. They hadn't noticed her presence, too absorbed in the documents spread before them. The timing is perfect, Natalie was saying, her manicured finger tracing a line on what appeared to be legal papers. Once the party ends, you can tell her everything. The preparations are complete. Richard ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, a gesture Catherine had once found endearing, but now seemed weighted with deception. Are you sure about this timing after the party seems cruel? It's ideal, Natalie insisted, her voice carrying a note of impatience. She'll be emotional, vulnerable, more likely to sign quickly without scrutinizing everything. We've worked too hard to let her discover the offshore accounts or the property transfers. The crystal flute nearly slipped from Catherine's fingers. Divorce papers. On her 40th birthday. She steadied herself against the door frame, watching as Natalie perched herself on the edge of Richard's desk, her skirt riding up her thighs. You're brilliant. You know that, Richard said, reaching for Natalie's hand. I couldn't have planned this without you. What about the prenup? Natalie asked, fingers intertwining with his. Richard laughed that confident laugh that had once made Catherine feel safe. Ironclad. She'll walk away with barely enough to rent an apartment. After all, I drafted it myself. The betrayal burned like acid in Catherine's throat. 15 years of marriage. Their renovated Victorian in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood. Their daughter Rebecca, now studying art history in Paris. All of it about to be swept away in a single evening. Catherine backed away silently, her designer heels soundless on the plush carpet. Her mind raced through the signs she'd ignored the late nights at the office, the changed phone password, the sudden interest in overseas investments, the perfect birthday party Richard had insisted on hosting at home rather than at the restaurant she'd chosen. It'll be more intimate, he'd said with that practiced smile. She made her way downstairs, past the guests mingling in their garden. The spring evening air carried the scent of roses, her favorite flowers, and the sound of laughter that now seemed hollow and distant. Eleanor Walsh, her best friend of 20 years, approached with concern etched on her face. Cat, you look like you've seen a ghost. Catherine drew a deep breath, surprised at how steady her voice sounded. I need you to stay after the party, and I need to speak with Richard, now. Before Eleanor could respond, Catherine turned and marched back up the stairs, fury replacing the initial shock. She pushed open the study door without knocking. Richard and Natalie sprang apart, their guilty expressions confirming everything. Catherine. Richard recovered quickly, his lawyer's composure sliding back into place. We were just discussing the Morrison case. Save it, Catherine interrupted, her voice deadly calm. She locked eyes with Natalie. The party's winding down. I think it's time you left. Natalie glanced at Richard, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. She gathered her papers quickly, sliding them into a leather portfolio. Happy birthday, Mrs. Adler, Natalie said, her professional mask firmly in place as she edged past Catherine. When the door closed behind her, Catherine turned to Richard. Divorce papers on my birthday. Richard's face drained of color. You heard everything? Catherine set her champagne flute down with deliberate care. The offshore accounts, the property transfers, your little plan with your assistant. Catherine, this isn't how you wanted to ambush me, to steal what we've built together. Her voice rose despite her efforts to control it. 15 years. Richard, was any of it real? You don't understand the pressure I've been under, Richard began, his hand moving toward his phone on the desk. The firm, the expectations. Catherine reached for the phone before he could, unlocking it with the old password he hadn't changed on this device. A message from Natalie lit up the screen. She knows. Initiate Plan B. The sight of it snapped something in Catherine. She hurled the phone across the room. Plan B? How many schemes have you two cooked up? Richard lunged for her, grabbing her wrist. Give me that. You have no right. No right. Catherine wrenched away, but Richard's grip tightened. In the struggle, he pushed her backward, and she lost her balance, tumbling against the bookshelf. Pain shot through her shoulder as leather-bound law volumes crashed around her. Richard stood over her, momentarily frozen in shock at what he'd done. In 15 years of marriage, he had never laid a hand on her in anger. Catherine, I didn't mean, he started, reaching down to help her. She slapped his hand away, rising on her own. Get out. Get out of this house tonight, or I swear I'll go downstairs right now and tell everyone exactly what you're planning. The threat of public humiliation, something Richard Adler, respected pillar of Chicago's legal community, feared more than anything worked. He stepped back, adjusting his tie in a nervous gesture. We need to talk about this rationally, he said, lawyer mode engaging. There are financial considerations. We'll talk when I'm ready. Catherine cut him off. For now, go to your club, a hotel. I don't care. Just get out of my sight. After a tense standoff, Richard finally nodded, grabbed his phone and briefcase, and left the study. Catherine waited until she heard the front door close behind him before she allowed the tears to come. Eleanor found her there 10 minutes later, after seeing the last confused guests out. Jesus, Cat, what happened? She asked, taking in the scattered books and Catherine's reddening shoulder. My marriage just ended, Catherine replied, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. And I think I might need a lawyer. Dawn broke over Lake Michigan, casting golden light across Catherine's bedroom. She hadn't slept. Spending the night alternating between rage and disbelief, the previous evening felt like a nightmare, the kind that follows you into waking. Her phone buzzed with a message from Richard. I'm staying at the Peninsula. We need to talk. Please. Catherine silenced the phone and rose, wincing at the bruise forming on her shoulder. The house felt unnervingly quiet without Richard's morning routine. The coffee brewing, NPR playing softly in the kitchen, the rustle of the newspaper. After a shower, she stood in the doorway of his study, the scene of last night's revelation. A lawyer's wife for 15 years, Catherine had learned something: evidence was everything, and if Richard thought she would walk away with barely enough to rent an apartment, he had severely underestimated her. The study was immaculate. Natalie must have tidied the papers before leaving. Catherine moved methodically, starting with the desk drawers. Nothing unusual. The filing cabinet yielded only case files and household documents she was already familiar with. Behind the framed Ansel Adams print that dominated one wall, she found the wall safe. Richard thought she didn't know the combination, but she'd seen him open it last Christmas while retrieving her gift, a sapphire necklace that now felt like a mockery. Their anniversary date, 05/22/07. The safe swung open to reveal the expected items: their passports, Rebecca's birth certificate, some jewelry, and a small stack of documents. Catherine photographed everything with her phone before examining them. Most were unremarkable, but one folder contained statements for an account in the Cayman Islands that she'd never seen before. Large transfers had been moving through it for months, most recently to purchase a lakefront property in Michigan under an LLC called Phoenix Holdings. As she replaced the documents, her fingers brushed against something in the back of the safe, a small USB drive. She pocketed it without hesitation. The sound of the front door opening sent adrenaline coursing through her. Catherine quickly closed the safe and rearranged the print, her heart pounding. Hello, a male voice called out, not Richard's. Catherine grabbed a heavy crystal paperweight from the desk and moved toward the door. A man she didn't recognize appeared in the hallway, mid-30s, wearing work clothes with a toolbox in hand. Mrs. Adler, he asked, looking surprised to see her. I'm from Alliance Security. Mr. Adler scheduled a system upgrade for this morning. Catherine's grip on the paperweight tightened. I wasn't informed of any upgrade. The man shrugged. It's in our work order. Mr. Adler called it in last week. I can show you. That won't be necessary. Catherine interrupted, Richard changing the security system without telling her another piece of the puzzle. Please leave. I'm canceling the upgrade. Ma'am, I've already started the installation in the basement. Get out now, or I'm calling the police, Catherine said firmly, raising the paperweight slightly. The man backed away, hands up in surrender. No problem, lady. I'll just grab my stuff from downstairs. Catherine followed at a distance as he collected his tools and left, muttering about crazy rich people. She locked the door behind him and immediately called the security company. Alliance Security. This is Catherine Adler. Someone just came to my house claiming to be from your company. I see. No, we don't have an appointment scheduled. Yes, please send someone to check the system. As she hung up, Catherine noticed movement outside the front window, A black sedan parked across the street, engine running. The security man got in, and the car pulled away. A chill ran down her spine. That wasn't a security technician. Someone had been trying to access their home. Her phone rang. Eleanor. "Are you okay?" her friend asked without preamble. "I've been worried sick." "Someone just tried to break into my house under the guise of security maintenance," Catherine replied, moving away from the windows. "Jesus, Cat, call the police. And tell them what I don't have proof." Catherine paced the hallway. "Listen, can I come over? I need a safe place to look at something." "Of course." "Michael's here too. He came over for breakfast. He might be able to help." 20 minutes later, Catherine sat in Eleanor's sunlit kitchen. The USB drive connected to her friend's laptop. Dr. Michael Chin, Eleanor's older brother and a finance professor at Northwestern, studied the screen with growing concern. "These aren't just regular financial documents," he said, scrolling through spreadsheets. "This looks like a sophisticated money laundering operation." "Money laundering," Catherine echoed, the coffee in her stomach turning sour. "Richard is involved in money laundering." Michael adjusted his glasses. "I can't say for certain that Richard set this up, but someone is using these shell companies to move money. See these transactions? They're structured to avoid reporting requirements. And look here." He pointed to a name recurring throughout the documents. "Thomas Mitchell. Isn't that Richard's partner?" Catherine nodded. Thomas had been Richard's mentor at the firm, a senior partner who had sponsored Richard's ascent. They'd had dinner with the Mitchells countless times over the years. "There's something else," Michael continued, opening an image file. A photograph. The image showed Richard and Thomas standing with a third man Catherine didn't recognize, tall, imposing, with a distinctive tattoo visible on his neck. They appeared to be at some kind of construction site. "Who's that?" Eleanor asked, leaning over her brother's shoulder. "I don't know," Catherine replied, studying the stranger's face. "But Richard does." Michael saved the files to a secure cloud account he created for Catherine. "You need to be careful with this information. If this is what it looks like." A crash from the front of the house cut him off. Eleanor rushed to the hallway and screamed. Catherine and Michael followed to find a brick had been thrown through the front window. Glass scattered across the hardwood floor. Attached to the brick was a note with 2 words, "Stop looking." "The police aren't going to do anything," Catherine said, pacing Eleanor's living room as an officer finished taking their statement. "A random act of vandalism, that's what they're calling it." The officer, a young woman who had introduced herself as Officer Reyes, closed her notebook. "Without witnesses or surveillance footage, there's not much we can do, Mrs. Adler, but we'll increase patrols in the area." After she left, Michael locked the door and checked the security system. "You can't go back to your house. Cat, not alone." "I'm not running away," Catherine insisted. "That's exactly what they want." Eleanor asked. "Cat, what exactly do you think is happening here?" Catherine sank onto the sofa. "I don't know. But Richard, Thomas, Natalie, they're involved in something bigger than just my divorce." She touched her bruised shoulder absently. "And they're willing to go to extreme lengths to protect it." Eleanor and Michael exchanged concerned glances. "You need help," Michael said finally. "Professional help?" "I'm not seeing a therapist right now." "Michael, not that kind of help," he interrupted. "I know someone. Andrew Morrison, former Chicago PD, now works as a private investigator. He specializes in financial crimes and has contacts in federal law enforcement." Catherine hesitated. Hiring a PI felt like crossing a threshold, acknowledging that her life had truly devolved into something unrecognizable. Her phone buzzed with another message from Richard. "Coming home tonight. We need to resolve this." Decision made. She looked up at Michael. "Call your friend." Andrew Morrison arrived 2 hours later, a weathered man in his mid-50s, with shrewd eyes and the careful movements of someone accustomed to watching his back. His salt and pepper hair was cropped close, and his handshake was firm as Michael introduced them. "Dr. Chen explained some of your situation," he said, settling into a chair across from Catherine. "But I'd like to hear it from you." Catherine recounted everything that overheard conversation, the confrontation with Richard, the discovery of the USB drive, and the brick through Eleanor's window. Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound book. "Your husband's firm, Mitchell and Adler, has been on my radar for a while," he said when she finished. "Nothing concrete, but there have been whispers about some of their client connections." "What kind of connections?" Catherine asked. "The kind that don't appear in press releases," Morrison replied. "I've been tracking a real estate developer named Victor Salvatore. He's technically one of your husband's clients, but my sources suggest their relationship goes deeper than attorney-client." Catherine pulled out her phone and showed him the photograph. Is this him? The man with the tattoo? Morrison studied the image, his expression darkening. That's Salvatore. Where did you get this? From the USB drive. There's more financial records, property transactions. Morrison's interest visibly sharpened. Mrs. Adler, these men are dangerous. The brick through the window wasn't a random act, it was a warning. So, what do I do? Catherine asked, the reality of her situation settling like a weight on her chest. First, we secure your immediate safety. Then we gather more evidence. Morrison pulled out his own phone. I have a contact at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network who might be interested in those records, but we need to be careful if Salvatore has connections inside law enforcement, which I suspect he does. We can't trust the normal channels. I need to get back into my house, Catherine said. There might be more evidence there? Morrison shook his head. Too risky. Your husband knows you've seen the papers now. They'll be watching the house. Then what do you suggest? I'll put surveillance on Richard and Natalie, see where they go, who they meet with. Meanwhile, you stay somewhere unexpected, not with family or close friends. They'll be watching them too. Eleanor squeezed Catherine's hand. I have a client with a pied-à-terre in Streeterville. She's in Europe for the next month. I can ask if you can use it. Perfect, Morrison said, standing. No credit cards, no phone calls to your regular contacts. I'll get you a burner phone. As Morrison prepared to leave, Catherine stopped him. There's one more thing. Tonight is the installation for my gallery exhibition. I've been preparing for it for months. I can't just not show up. An art exhibition, Morrison frowned. That's too public, too predictable. It's my work, Catherine insisted. The first solo exhibition I've had in 5 years. If I don't appear, it will raise more questions than if I do. She met his gaze steadily. Besides, Richard doesn't know that I know about the money laundering. He thinks this is just about our divorce. Morrison considered this. All right, but I'll be there, and you'll wear a wire. If Richard or anyone associated with him approaches you, we'll have it recorded. After he left, Eleanor turned to Catherine with worried eyes. Cat, are you sure about this? It sounds like you're walking into the lion's den. Catherine looked down at her hands, the hands that had created the artwork for her exhibition, that had built her design business from scratch while supporting Richard's career, hands that had held their daughter when she was born, that had turned their house into a home. I've spent 15 years being the perfect corporate wife, she said quietly, supporting Richard, hosting his parties, raising our daughter. If he thinks I'm going to just disappear quietly, he doesn't know me at all. The Marshall Contemporary Gallery glowed against the Chicago twilight, its industrial chic space transformed by strategic lighting and the vibrant colors of Catherine's paintings. Her exhibition, Facades, Studies in Light and Shadow, featured architectural interiors that revealed hidden emotional landscapes, a reflection of her dual career as both designer and artist. Catherine moved through the gathering crowd in a midnight blue dress, accepting congratulations with practiced grace. The wire Morrison had given her was concealed beneath her clothing, the receiver disguised as a brooch at her shoulder. Eleanor managed the event with professional efficiency, but Catherine caught the worried glances her friend kept casting her way. Morrison was somewhere in the crowd, posing as a potential buyer. The weight of the revelations from the past 24 hours pressed upon her. But Catherine maintained her composure, a skill honed through years of corporate events at Richard's side. There's my talented wife. Richard's voice behind her sent a chill down Catherine's spine. She turned to face him, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. His handsome features, once so beloved, now seemed like a mask concealing something darker. Richard, she acknowledged coolly, I wasn't sure you'd come. And miss your triumph. He leaned in to kiss her cheek, his cologne the same one she'd given him for Christmas now cloying. We need to talk, Catherine, about last night. This isn't the place, she replied, conscious of the wire recording their every word. Then let me take you to dinner after, he persisted, his hand at the small of her back, possessive, controlling. The peninsula has a private dining room. We can sort this out like adults. Catherine stepped away from his touch. I'm needed here until closing. Tomorrow. Perhaps. Richard's smile tightened. Catherine, don't be difficult. What happened last night was a misunderstanding. Those papers, they weren't what you think. Weren't they? She met his gaze directly. I heard you. Richard, you and Natalie, planning to blindside me with divorce papers at my own birthday party. Richard glanced around nervously, noting a few curious onlookers. Keep your voice down, he hissed. This isn't the forum for airing our private matters. Is that what concerns you, public appearances? Catherine laughed softly, bitterly. Always the respected attorney, aren't you? What would your colleagues say if they knew you were planning to leave your wife of 15 years with barely enough to rent an apartment? The color drained from Richard's face. You don't understand the pressure I'm under, he said, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. There are complications, financial entanglements that affect both of us. Mr. Adler. A voice interrupted them. Thomas Mitchell approached, champagne in hand, his silver hair and tailored suit projecting success and confidence. Congratulations on your wife's remarkable talent. These pieces are extraordinary. Catherine felt Richard tense beside her. The dynamic between the two men had shifted. Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes, and Richard's posture had become deferential. Thomas, good to see you, Richard replied, his lawyer's composure sliding back into place. Catherine has outdone herself, hasn't she? Thomas turned to Catherine, his gaze assessing. Indeed, such perception in these works. You have a gift for revealing what lies beneath the surface. Mrs. Adler? The double meaning wasn't lost on Catherine. Thank you, Thomas. Sometimes we don't truly see what's in front of us until the light changes. A flicker of something concerned warning crossed Thomas's face. How philosophical. Speaking of change, Richard, we need to discuss the Salvatore portfolio tomorrow. There have been some developments. Of course, Richard nodded, a muscle twitching in his jaw. First thing tomorrow. Thomas's attention returned to Catherine. Your shoulder, what happened there? Catherine touched the visible bruise, noting Richard's discomfort. A small accident, books falling from a shelf. How unfortunate, Thomas replied, his tone suggesting he didn't believe her. Well, I won't keep you from your admirers, Richard. Tomorrow at 8. As Thomas moved away, Catherine caught sight of a familiar face across the gallery. Andrew Morrison, pretending to study one of her larger canvases. He gave an almost imperceptible nod. I need to circulate, Catherine told Richard. We'll talk tomorrow. Before he could protest, she moved toward a group of collectors, leaving him standing alone. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of conversations and sales. Catherine maintained her professional demeanor, but her mind raced with questions. Thomas Mitchell clearly knew something was amiss. The way he'd looked at her, the veiled reference to revealing what lies beneath, he was sending a message. As the event wound down, Eleanor approached with a glass of water. Your red dots are multiplying, she said, referring to the sold indicators on many paintings. Successful night by any measure. Richard's here, Catherine replied quietly. And Thomas Mitchell. Eleanor's smile faltered. Morrison saw them. He wants you to leave now, while they're distracted with other guests. I'll handle the closing. Catherine hesitated, looking around at the remaining attendees. I can't just disappear. Cat! Eleanor cut in, her voice low and urgent. Morrison spotted someone else here, the man from the photograph Salvatore. He's by the bar, watching you. Catherine's blood ran cold. She discreetly glanced toward the bar area and saw him, the tall figure from the photograph, his neck tattoo partially visible above his collar. He raised his glass slightly when their eyes met, a smile playing at his lips. Go out through the back, Eleanor instructed. Morrison is waiting with a car. Catherine squeezed her friend's hand. Be careful. If Richard asks, I'll say you had a migraine. Now go. Catherine slipped through the staff area to the rear exit, where Morrison waited in a nondescript sedan. Get in, he said tersely as she approached. We've got a problem. Once they were moving, Morrison explained, Salvatore being at your exhibition wasn't a coincidence. He never attends these kinds of events. He was there to observe you. Why? Catherine asked, the city lights blurring past the car windows. Because you're a loose end, Morrison replied grimly. I had my guy run the financials on that USB drive. The money moving through those accounts. It's tied to a major development project called Phoenix, a luxury high-rise complex breaking ground next month. Phoenix Holdings, Catherine murmured, remembering the LLC name from the documents. The Michigan property, Morrison nodded. That's just one piece. The development is here in Chicago, the Old Arts District, Southwest Side. Catherine's heart sank. The neighborhood where my mother grew up, there's a community art center there where I used to volunteer. Well, someone wants that land badly. The holding companies have been buying up properties, applying pressure on holdouts. There have been mysterious fires, code violations suddenly appearing. And Richard is involved in this. Morrison turned onto Lakeshore Drive, the illuminated skyline reflecting on the dark waters. Your husband's firm is handling all the legal work, securing permits despite community opposition. But here's the kicker. The money behind the project isn't clean. We're talking about international funds being washed through legitimate businesses. Like money laundering, Catherine said, remembering Michael's assessment. Exactly like money laundering. And if Salvatore is involved, we're not just talking about dirty money, we're talking about dangerous people. They drove in silence for a few minutes, Catherine processing this information. The wire, she finally said. Did you get anything useful from my conversation with Richard? Morrison patted his jacket pocket. He all but admitted there's something bigger going on. His comment about financial entanglements is telling, but it's what Mitchell said that interests me more, the reference to developments with the Salvatore portfolio. He was warning Richard, Catherine realized, and possibly you, with that comment about revealing what's beneath the surface. Morrison turned onto a side street, checking the rearview mirror. We're being followed. Catherine twisted in her seat to look behind them. A black SUV had appeared, gaining ground quickly. Hold on, Morrison instructed, accelerating through a yellow light. The SUV did the same, its engine growling as it closed the distance. Morrison took a sharp right, then an immediate left, navigating the city streets with practiced precision. The SUV stayed with them, now close enough that Catherine could see the driver's silhouette. Who are they? She asked, gripping the door handle as Morrison executed another turn. Could be Salvatore's people. Could be someone else. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a handgun, placing it in the center console. Just in case. Catherine stared at the weapon, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. 24 hours ago, she had been preparing for her birthday party, believing she was living a charmed life with a successful husband. Now she was in a car being chased by unknown assailants, a gun within reach. Morrison turned into an alley, cut the headlights, and killed the engine, pulling into a loading dock's shadow. The SUV roared past the alley entrance a moment later. We lost them for now, Morrison said, restarting the car. But we need to get you somewhere safe. 20 minutes later, they arrived at the Streeterville apartment Eleanor had arranged. The sleek high-rise had excellent security, a 24-hour doorman, keycard access, and no connection to Catherine's usual life. Stay here, Morrison instructed as they entered the minimalist space. Don't use your regular phone. Don't contact anyone except through me. I'll have someone watching the building. Catherine sank onto the pristine white sofa, suddenly exhausted. What about tomorrow? Richard is expecting to meet with me. Let him wait, Morrison replied, checking the apartment's locks and sightlines. Right now, we need more information before you confront him again. After Morrison left, Catherine stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the city she'd called home her entire life. Somewhere out there, Richard was returning to their empty house, perhaps already planning his next move. Thomas Mitchell was likely reporting to someone about their interaction at the gallery, and Victor Salvatore, the man with the tattoo, was undoubtedly wondering just how much she knew. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, Safe Eleanor, using the burner phone Morrison had given her. For now, Catherine replied. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added, What have I gotten myself into, Elle? The response came quickly. The truth, whatever it costs. Catherine set the phone down and moved to the apartment's second bedroom, which had been converted into a small studio space. Canvases leaned against the walls, and an easel stood by the window. Eleanor had thought of everything. She picked up a charcoal pencil, finding comfort in its familiar weight. On a fresh canvas, she began to sketch the shadows of her home, the sharp angles of Richard's study, the figures half hidden in darkness. As her hand moved across the surface, a new understanding began to take shape. Richard wasn't just betraying her. He was afraid of something. Or someone. She would find out what and why. Catherine woke to the sound of her burner phone ringing. She'd fallen asleep in the studio. Charcoal smudged on her hands, and the canvas before her filled with dark, angular shapes. Mrs. Adler, it's Morrison. Turn on the news. Fumbling for the remote, Catherine switched on the apartment's television. A breaking news banner scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Fire at Historic Arts Center in Pilsen District. The camera showed firefighters battling flames at a familiar brick building, the Community Arts Center, where Catherine had taught weekend classes for years. That's not a coincidence, is it? She asked, her voice hollow. No, Morrison confirmed. The center was one of the last holdouts against the Phoenix development. The director refused an offer last week. Catherine sank onto the edge of the bed. Was anyone hurt? No injuries reported? The fire started after hours. Morrison's voice turned grim. This is how they operate, increasing pressure until resistance crumbles. And Richard is part of this, Catherine said, the words tasting bitter, helping them clear the neighborhood for their development. We need to know exactly what his role is, Morrison replied. Which brings me to why I called. Richard has been trying to reach you all morning. He's called your regular phone a dozen times. Catherine checked her regular cell's 17 missed calls and multiple texts from Richard. growing increasingly urgent. Where are you? We need to talk. This isn't just about us anymore. Catherine, please call me. It's important. The last message sent a chill through her. They know you have the USB drive. You're in danger? He's panicking, Morrison observed when she read him the messages. This could work to our advantage. Or he could be setting a trap, Catherine countered. Possibly, but my surveillance report from this morning is interesting. Richard met with Thomas Mitchell as planned, but the meeting ended in what appeared to be an argument. Richard left looking shaken. Catherine considered this. What if Richard isn't a willing participant? What if he's being coerced somehow? That would explain some things, Morrison acknowledged. Either way, we need to find out. I think it's time you spoke with him, but on our terms, not his. They arranged for Catherine to call Richard from the burner phone, suggesting a meeting at the Art Institute, a public place with plenty of witnesses and security cameras. Morrison would be nearby, monitoring everything. At noon, Catherine sat on a bench in the American Art Gallery, surrounded by iconic works from Edward Hopper and Georgia O'Keeffe. The museum's Thursday crowd moved around her tourists, art students, elderly couples. Richard arrived exactly on time, his appearance startling her. The always impeccable attorney looked disheveled, his suit wrinkled, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Catherine, he breathed, relief evident in his voice as he approached. He moved to embrace her, but she held up a hand to stop him. Sit down, Richard, she said quietly, and explain to me exactly what's going on. He sank onto the bench beside her, running a hand through his unkempt hair. Where have you been? I've been worried sick. Worried I might expose whatever you're involved in, Catherine asked coldly. No, worried you might get hurt, Richard replied, his voice dropping. Catherine, you don't understand what you've stumbled into. The USB drive. The one with records of money being laundered through shell companies. The one showing your firm's connection to Victor Salvatore. She watched his face pale. Yes, I've seen it all. Richard glanced around nervously. Not here. We can't talk about this here. We talk here, or we don't talk at all, Catherine insisted. I want the truth. Richard, all of it. For a long moment, he stared at Hopper's Nighthawks, on the wall across from them isolated figures in a late-night diner, separated from the darkened city by glass. Finally, he seemed to deflate. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he began, his voice barely audible. It started small. Thomas asked me to handle some real estate acquisitions for a new client. Standard work, nothing unusual. Then the client wanted certain permits expedited, certain inspections overlooked. Salvatore, Catherine supplied. Richard nodded. At first, I told myself it was just aggressive development tactics. Chicago real estate has always been a rough game, but then I saw the money where it was coming from, how it was being moved, and instead of reporting it, you helped facilitate it, Catherine said, unable to keep the accusation from her voice. I tried to back out, Richard insisted, turning to face her. That's when Thomas showed me what they had on me. Which was what? Richard's gaze dropped to his hands. Gambling debts, a lot of them. I've been playing high-stakes poker for years. It started as client entertainment. But, he trailed off. You got in too deep, Catherine finished, pieces clicking into place. How much? Almost $2 million, Richard admitted, shame evident in every line of his face. I kept thinking I could win it back, turn it around. Instead, I just dug the hole deeper. Catherine felt sick. So they owned you? Thomas made it clear either I helped with the legal work for Phoenix or they'd destroy me. Disbarment would be just the beginning. Richard's voice cracked. I convinced myself I was protecting you and Rebecca. If I lost my license, my reputation. So you decided to divorce me instead? Catherine interrupted, anger flaring. Leave me with nothing while you, what, ran off with your assistant. Richard looked genuinely confused. What no, the divorce was to protect you. Catherine? To distance you legally from whatever might happen when this all comes crashing down. Protect me. Catherine gave a bitter laugh. By making sure I'd walk away with barely enough to rent an apartment? I heard you, Richard, I heard you and Natalie planning it all. Richard's face drained of color. Catherine, that's not, don't lie to me anymore. She cut him off. I heard you call her brilliant. Saw you hold her hand. Was she part of their plan too? A plan to keep an eye on you? Natalie isn't what you think, Richard began, then stopped abruptly, his gaze fixed on something over Catherine's shoulder. His expression changed to one of alarm. We need to leave, now. Catherine turned to see what had frightened him. A man in a dark suit had entered the gallery, his hand inside his jacket. Nothing overtly threatening, but Richard was already standing. Catherine, please, he urged, real fear in his voice. They followed me. She hesitated only a moment before rising. Whatever Richard had done, the terror in his eyes was genuine. They moved quickly through the galleries, Richard guiding her with a hand at her elbow. Catherine caught sight of Morrison trailing them at a distance, his presence reassuring. "Where are we going?" she asked as they descended the grand staircase. "Out the Michigan Avenue exit," Richard replied, scanning the crowd. "There's a taxi stand." "Richard." The voice stopped them cold. Thomas Mitchell stood at the bottom of the stairs, immaculately dressed as always, a benign smile on his face. Beside him was Victor Salvatore, his imposing presence drawing glances from passing museum goers. "Thomas," Richard acknowledged, his grip on Catherine's arm tightening. "What a coincidence." "Hardly," Thomas replied pleasantly. "Mrs. Adler, lovely to see you again. I hope you're recovering from your accident with the falling books." Catherine met his gaze steadily. "Fully recovered, thank you." "Wonderful." Thomas smiled. "Richard, our mutual friend would like a word." He gestured toward Salvatore. "Perhaps somewhere more private. I'm afraid we have a lunch reservation." Richard demurred. "Another time." Salvatore spoke for the first time, his voice surprisingly soft for such a large man. "This won't take long. It concerns a small item that's gone missing. A storage device, I believe." Catherine felt Richard tense beside her. She scanned the crowded entrance hall for Morrison, but couldn't locate him. "We don't know anything about that," Richard replied, attempting to guide Catherine around the two men. Salvatore stepped into their path. "I think you do. In fact, I think your wife might know exactly where it is." His cold eyes fixed on Catherine. "Don't you, Mrs. Adler?" Before she could respond, a security guard approached their group. "Is everything all right here?" "Fine," Thomas answered smoothly. "Just discussing art with old friends." The guard looked unconvinced, his gaze moving between the tension-filled group. "Ma'am," he addressed Catherine directly. "Are you okay?" It was the opening she needed. "Actually, these men are bothering us. My husband and I would appreciate an escort to the exit." The guard nodded, positioning himself between Catherine and Richard and the other two men. "This way, please." As they moved toward the exit, Catherine heard Salvatore call after them. "This isn't over. Richard, you know what's at stake." Outside, the spring air felt like freedom after the suffocating encounter. The guard remained with them until they reached the taxi stand. "Thank you," Catherine told him sincerely. "No problem," he replied. Those guys seemed intense. Once in a taxi, Richard slumped against the seat, trembling slightly. "That was too close. Tell the driver to take us to Millennium Park," Catherine instructed, knowing Morrison would follow. "We're not finished talking." In the relative privacy of the moving taxi, Richard seemed to collapse in on himself. "They know you have the USB drive. They must have been watching the house, saw you go into my study." "What's on it that has them so worried?" Catherine asked. "Everything," Richard replied, his voice hollow. "Transaction records, communications, property acquisitions, the entire Phoenix operation. Thomas had me compile it as insurance, but I made a copy." "Insurance against what?" "Against Salvatore turning on him. This whole development is built on dirty money Eastern European funds with questionable origins. If it ever came to light—" He trailed off, then continued more quietly. "Catherine, these people don't just threaten careers. They threaten lives." The taxi pulled up at Millennium Park. After paying the driver, they walked toward Cloudgate the Bean, its reflective surface distorting their images as they approached. "Why didn't you come to me?" Catherine asked, watching their warped reflections. 15 years of marriage, and you couldn't tell me you were in trouble." Richard's distorted reflection wouldn't meet her eyes. "I was ashamed. The gambling. I knew how disappointed you'd be. And then when Thomas pulled me into this Phoenix mess, it was too late. I was in too deep. So you decided divorce was the answer, cutting me loose." "It seemed like the only way to protect you," Richard insisted. "If everything fell apart, if I was arrested or worse, you'd be legally separated from my problems, while conveniently leaving me without resources," Catherine noted bitterly. "That's not," Richard began, then stopped, confusion crossing his features. "The prenup adjustments weren't my idea. Thomas had his legal team draft them. I never intended to leave you destitute. Catherine, you have to believe that." Catherine studied him, trying to separate truth from lies. The Richard she'd known for 15 years had been ambitious but ethical, sometimes distant but never cruel. The man before her now seemed broken, trapped. "What about Natalie?" she asked. "Where does she fit into this?" Richard glanced around nervously before responding. "Natalie was assigned to me after my previous assistant retired. Thomas arranged it. She reports to him." Not me. A spy, Catherine realized. Essentially. Richard nodded. She monitors my calls, my meetings, makes sure I'm following their playbook. They circled the bean, their conversation hidden among the tourists, taking selfies with the sculpture. What happens now? Catherine finally asked. They know I have the drive. They'll come after me. We need to go to the authorities, Richard said, surprising her. The FBI, maybe, with that evidence, Mr. and Mrs. Adler. They both turned to find Andrew Morrison standing a few feet away, his expression grim. Morrison, Catherine acknowledged. I know who he is. Morrison interrupted. Richard Adler, currently under investigation by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network for his role in the Phoenix development scheme. Richard paled. You're with the FBI, private investigator, Morrison corrected. But I have friends in federal law enforcement who are very interested in what's on that USB drive. You hired a PI, Richard asked Catherine, hurt and betrayal evident in his voice. After finding out my husband was planning to divorce me and leave me with nothing. Yes, I did, Catherine replied sharply. Morrison stepped closer. We don't have time for marital disputes. Mrs. Adler, we need to move. Now, Salvatore's men are in the park. Catherine scanned the area and spotted them 2 men in dark suits moving purposefully through the crowd. My car's this way, Morrison said, gesturing toward Michigan Avenue. Wait, Richard grabbed Catherine's arm. You can't trust him. How do you know he's not working for them? Because Eleanor's brother vouched for him, Catherine replied, pulling away from Richard's grasp, which is more than I can say for you right now. Richard looked stricken. Catherine, please, let me make this right. I know I've betrayed your trust, but I never wanted you hurt. For a moment, Catherine wavered. Despite everything, this was the man she'd built a life with, the father of her daughter. Mr. Adler, decision time, Morrison interrupted. You can come with us and tell the feds everything you know, or you can go back to your friends Mitchell and Salvatore. But decide now. Richard stared at Catherine, his eyes pleading. I'll come. I'll tell them everything. Just don't shut me out. Catherine, not yet. Morrison nodded tersely. This way, and stay close. As they hurried toward Michigan Avenue, Catherine caught sight of their reflection in a storefront window herself, Richard and Morrison moving in perfect sync, like dancers in a dangerous ballet. Behind them, Salvatore's men had spotted their movement and were picking up pace. They've seen us, she warned. Almost there, Morrison assured them, guiding them around a corner to where a sedan waited, engine running. As they reached the vehicle, a black SUV screeched to a halt at the intersection, blocking their path. Victor Salvatore emerged from the passenger side, flanked by his men. Richard, he called, his voice carrying across the street. This is becoming tiresome. Morrison pushed Catherine toward the sedan. Get in, both of you. The drive, Salvatore continued, approaching steadily. That's all we want. Return it, and this ends now. Richard hesitated, looking between the sedan and Salvatore. Richard, Catherine urged, already sliding into the back seat. Don't. For one terrible moment, she thought he might cross the street, return to the devil he knew. Then he ducked into the car beside her. Morrison slammed the door and jumped into the driver's seat, accelerating away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, Catherine saw Salvatore watching them go, his expression impassive. He'll come after us, Richard said, his voice shaking. He won't stop. Let him try, Morrison replied grimly, navigating through downtown traffic. Right now, we've got bigger concerns. The FBI wants to talk to both of you tonight. Catherine looked at Richard, seeing not the confident attorney she'd married, but a frightened man facing the consequences of his choices. He met her gaze, remorse etched in every line of his face. I'm sorry, he whispered, reaching for her hand. For everything. Catherine didn't pull away, but she didn't squeeze back either. The trust between them, built over 15 years, lay in ruins. Whether it could be salvaged remained to be seen. As Morrison's car carried them toward an uncertain future, Catherine thought of the painting she'd been working on in the Streeterville apartment shadows and light, figures half hidden in darkness. The canvas had revealed a truth she'd only begun to understand. Nothing was as simple as it first appeared. Not her marriage, not Richard's betrayal, not the dangerous game they were now caught in, and certainly not the road ahead. The FBI field office in Chicago occupied several floors of a nondescript federal building downtown. Catherine and Richard sat in separate interview rooms, the bureaucratic beige walls a stark contrast to the drama unfolding in their lives. Special Agent Lisa Hendricks had been questioning Catherine for over 2 hours, her no-nonsense demeanor neither friendly nor hostile as she methodically worked through the evidence from the USB drive. So, to clarify, Hendricks said, consulting her notes, you had no knowledge of your husband's gambling debts or his involvement with the Phoenix development until you overheard the conversation at your birthday party. None, Catherine confirmed, fatigue settling into her bones. Richard kept his gambling completely hidden from me. I managed our household finances, but he handled his own business accounts. Hendricks made another note. And the offshore accounts, the property transfers? I knew nothing about those either. Catherine rubbed her temples, a headache forming. We had a prenuptial agreement when we married. I kept my design business separate. He kept his legal practice separate. It seemed sensible at the time. Yet you maintained joint accounts as well. For household expenses, yes, and investments for Rebecca's education. Catherine's thoughts turned to her daughter, still blissfully unaware in Paris of the implosion of her parents' lives. Agent Hendricks, my daughter doesn't know any of this yet. I'd like to be the one to tell her. Hendricks's expression softened slightly. We have no reason to contact your daughter at this time, Mrs. Adler, but you should know this investigation is moving quickly. The evidence you provided links to several other ongoing cases involving international money laundering. Will Richard face charges? Catherine asked, the question that had been hovering unspoken throughout the interview. That depends on his level of cooperation and the extent of his involvement, Hendricks replied carefully. The fact that he came in voluntarily works in his favor. A knock at the door interrupted them. Another agent poked his head in, gesturing for Hendricks to step outside. When she returned moments later, her expression had changed. Mrs. Adler, we have a development. I need you to come with me. Catherine followed Hendricks down a sterile hallway to a conference room where Andrew Morrison waited with Richard and another man she didn't recognize, older, distinguished, with silver hair and the unmistakable bearing of a senior federal official. Mrs. Adler, the man greeted her, extending his hand. Deputy Director James Keller, please, have a seat. Catherine sat beside Morrison, across from Richard, who looked utterly drained. His eyes met hers briefly, conveying a mixture of apology and resignation. We've been listening to your husband's testimony with great interest, Keller began. It appears the Phoenix development case connects to an investigation we've been building for nearly 3 years against Victor Salvatore and his organization. Organization, Catherine echoed. Salvatore is more than just a developer with questionable financing, Keller explained. He's a key figure in a network that uses real estate developments to launder money from Eastern European criminal enterprises. Your husband has provided us with crucial details about how they operate. Catherine glanced at Richard, who seemed to have aged a decade in the past few hours. So what happens now? That's what we need to discuss, Keller replied, folding his hands on the table. Based on your husband's cooperation, we're prepared to offer him a deal reduced charges in exchange for his continued assistance with our investigation. What kind of assistance? Catherine asked, suspicion rising. Morrison shifted beside her. They want Richard to wear a wire. Get Thomas Mitchell and Salvatore on record discussing the Phoenix development and their financing methods. That's insane, Catherine protested, turning to Keller. You've seen what these people are capable of. They burned down a community center. They've been threatening us. If they suspect Richard is working with you, it's my choice, Catherine. Richard interrupted quietly. It's the only way to make this right. She stared at him, seeing determination beneath the exhaustion. You could get hurt, or worse. I know, he acknowledged, but I've been a coward long enough. I let these people threaten our community, use my legal expertise to facilitate their crimes. I need to fix what I helped break. Catherine felt a complicated surge of emotions, anger at his past choices, fear for his safety, and underneath it all, a reluctant admiration for his willingness to face the consequences. There's more, Keller continued. Thomas Mitchell has scheduled a meeting for tomorrow evening. All the key investors in the Phoenix development, including Salvatore. It's the perfect opportunity to gather evidence against the entire network. And Richard just walks in there? Catherine asked incredulously. After he's been seen with me and Morrison, they already suspect something's wrong. That's where you come in, Mrs. Adler, Keller said carefully. We need you to accompany your husband to this meeting. Absolutely not, Morrison interjected. Catherine isn't trained for this kind of operation. Hear me out, Keller continued. The meeting is taking place at the Chicago Architectural Foundation Gala. Your presence as Richard's wife would be expected, especially given your professional background. Your attendance would help allay any suspicions Mitchell and Salvatore might have. You want to use me as cover, Catherine realized. We want your assistance, Keller corrected. You'd both be wired. with agents positioned throughout the venue. At the first sign of trouble, we extract you. Catherine looked at Richard, who seemed as troubled by the suggestion as she was. This wasn't my idea, he said quickly. I told them I wouldn't involve you. Mrs. Adler. Hendricks spoke up from her position by the door. This would be entirely voluntary, but your presence could make the difference between success and failure. Catherine thought of the Community Arts Center, now a charred shell, of the neighborhood where her mother had grown up, being systematically dismantled for profit, of the lies and manipulation that had nearly destroyed her life. If I do this, she said slowly, I want something in return. Keller raised an eyebrow. What did you have in mind? Protection for the remaining businesses in that neighborhood, specifically the rebuilding of the arts center that was destroyed. And I want to guarantee that none of our assets will be seized. My design business remains untouched by all this. Keller and Hendricks exchanged glances. We can work with the U.S. Attorney's Office on those terms. Keller finally agreed. Provided your cooperation leads to successful prosecutions. One more thing, Catherine added. I want to know who Natalie Winters really is. A small smile played at the corners of Keller's mouth. I was wondering when you'd ask about her. He nodded to Hendricks, who opened the conference room door. Natalie Winters walked in, but the woman who entered bore little resemblance to the polished legal assistant Catherine had come to despise. Gone was the sleek corporate attire, replaced by practical dark clothing. Her demeanor had changed too, more confident, more authoritative. Mrs. Adler, she acknowledged with a nod. I believe we've met under somewhat different circumstances. Natalie is one of our undercover agents, Keller explained. She's been embedded in Mitchell's firm for the past 10 months, gathering evidence on the Phoenix operation. Catherine stared at the woman who had seemed to be having an affair with her husband, trying to reconcile this new information. You were never romantically involved with your husband, Natalie finished. No. That was part of my cover, making it appear I had influence over Richard, which gave me access to Mitchell's inner circle. But I heard you both discussing the divorce, planning to blindside me, Catherine insisted. You heard what Mitchell's surveillance in Richard's office was meant to hear, Natalie explained. We knew the study was bugged. The conversation was staged. Catherine turned to Richard, who nodded confirmation. I couldn't tell you the truth, Catherine, not without putting you and Natalie in danger. The divorce papers were real, but the motivation wasn't what you thought. So, everything the prenup changes. The offshore accounts, that was all to protect me, Catherine asked, struggling to process this revelation. The prenup changes were Mitchell's idea, Richard admitted. I went along with it to maintain my cover, but I never intended to follow through. As for the offshore accounts, he looked down at his hands. Those were real. My gambling debts put us in this position. I can't escape that responsibility. Catherine felt as though the room was spinning slightly. Everything she thought she knew had been upended yet again. Mrs. Adler, Natalie said gently, I know this is a lot to take in, but we need your decision about tomorrow night's operation. The gala represents our best opportunity to gather evidence against everyone involved. Catherine studied the faces around her, Morrison's cautious professionalism, Keller's measured intensity, Hendricks's quiet competence, Natalie's unexpected alliance, and Richard's desperate hope for redemption. I'll do it, she said finally. Not for you, she added, looking directly at Richard. For the neighborhood they're trying to destroy. For the people who've already been hurt by this scheme. Relief crossed Richard's features, quickly replaced by concern. Catherine, if anything happens to you, it won't, Keller interrupted confidently. We'll have agents positioned throughout the venue. You'll both be wired and under constant surveillance. At the first sign of trouble, we move in. As the meeting concluded with details for the operation, Catherine found herself standing beside Natalie in the hallway, while Richard continued his debriefing. For what it's worth, Natalie said quietly, your husband fought against involving you in any of this. He was trying to protect you the only way he knew how. By lying to me for months, Catherine asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. By keeping you at arm's length from some very dangerous people, Natalie countered. I'm not defending his choices, the gambling, the initial involvement with Mitchell. But when things got dangerous, his first concern was always your safety. Catherine sighed, the emotional exhaustion of the past 2 days catching up with her. I don't know what to believe anymore. Believe this, Natalie said, her expression serious. Tomorrow night, we have a chance to take down an organization that's hurt a lot of people. Whatever happens between you and Richard afterward is between you two. But right now, we need to work together. Morrison approached, car keys in hand. Ready to go, I'm taking you back to the Streeterville apartment. Agents will be stationed outside all night. Catherine nodded, then glanced back at the conference room where Richard remained with the federal agents. What about him? Protective custody, Morrison replied. They'll keep him secure until tomorrow's operation. As they walked toward the elevator, Catherine's phone buzzed with a message on the burner, Eleanor checking in. Everything okay? Any news? Catherine stared at the screen, wondering how to possibly summarize the day's revelations. Finally, she typed, Richard's cooperating with FBI. I'm safe. Tomorrow is the end game. Eleanor's response came seconds later. What can I do? Catherine thought for a moment, then replied, Call Rebecca. Tell her I'll be contacting her soon. Don't give details. Just tell her everything's going to be all right. Whether that was true remained to be seen, but Catherine held on to the hope as Morrison drove her through the nighttime streets of Chicago, the city she loved, the city where she'd built her life, the city that had suddenly become the backdrop for a dangerous game she never wanted to play. Tomorrow would determine how the game ended for all of them. The morning of the Chicago Architectural Foundation Gala dawned with ominous gray skies, mirroring Catherine's mood as she stood at the window of the Streeterville apartment. Sleep had evaded her, leaving her mind to cycle through the cascade of revelations from the previous day. Her phone chimed with a message from Agent Hendricks. Meeting at 10 a.m. to prepare for tonight. Car will collect you at 9:30. Catherine set the phone down and moved to the small studio, where her half-finished canvas awaited. The charcoal sketch had evolved overnight into something more defined, shadowy figures circling a central light, faces half hidden, hands reaching. She picked up a brush and began adding color, finding calm in the familiar motions. Eleanor called as Catherine was finishing her coffee. You're all over the news, her friend said without preamble. What? Catherine nearly dropped her mug. Not you specifically, Eleanor clarified. The Phoenix development. The Tribune is running a story about federal investigations into foreign investment in Chicago real estate. They're not naming names yet, but they mention a prominent legal firm being scrutinized. Thomas Mitchell must be in panic mode, Catherine mused. How are you holding up? Eleanor asked, concern evident in her voice. Catherine sighed, watching rain begin to speckle the windows. Honestly, I don't know. Everything I thought I knew about my life has been turned upside down. Richard wasn't having an affair, but he was gambling away our security. He was trying to protect me, but by lying to me for months. And now I'm about to walk into a room full of potentially dangerous people wearing an FBI wire. Are you sure about doing this tonight? Eleanor pressed. It sounds incredibly risky. What choice do I have? These people threatened us, burned down a community center. They need to be stopped. Catherine paused, then added more quietly. Besides, part of me needs to see this through to understand exactly what Richard got himself involved in. Did you speak with Rebecca? Not yet, Catherine admitted. I'll call her after tonight. I don't want her worried while this is happening. A knock at the door signaled the arrival of her FBI escort. I have to go, Elle. I'll call you when it's over. Be careful, Eleanor urged. And Kat. Whatever happens with Richard afterward, take your time deciding. 15 years isn't something you throw away without careful thought. The FBI's Chicago field office hummed with activity when Catherine arrived. Agent Hendricks led her to a conference room where Richard already waited, looking slightly better than he had the previous night. He'd been given fresh clothes, a dress shirt, and slacks that weren't quite his usual standard, but were presentable. Catherine, he greeted her, relief evident in his voice. Are you okay? As well as can be expected, she replied, maintaining an emotional distance despite the urge to either embrace or berate him. Those conversations would come later if they both survived tonight. Natalie entered, dressed in the business attire Catherine had come to associate with her, though now knowing her true identity changed the context entirely. Mrs. Adler, she nodded professionally. Thank you for agreeing to help. Deputy Director Keller followed, accompanied by several technical specialists carrying equipment cases. Let's get started, Keller announced, spreading blueprints of the Chicago Cultural Center, the gala's venue, across the conference table. The event begins at 7 p.m. Key players will be arriving between 7:30 and 8. Our intelligence suggests Mitchell has arranged a private meeting with the Phoenix investors in the GAR Memorial Hall at 9 p.m. He pointed to a section of the blueprint. This is where we need to get recording devices. Richard, you'll be wearing this. A technician opened a case to reveal what appeared to be an ordinary tie clip. State-of-the-art audio and video capture. The receiver is embedded in the clip itself. No external wires to discover if they search you. Richard nodded, his expression grim but determined. Mrs. Adler, Keller continued, you'll be wearing these. The technician presented a pair of elegant diamond earrings. Same technology, different housing. They're equipped with panic buttons. Squeeze the back of either earring for 3 seconds, and our team moves in immediately. Catherine accepted the earrings, their weight surprisingly substantial for their size. What exactly are we trying to capture? She asked. Ideally, explicit mentions of the money sources for Phoenix, admissions about the community center fire, and any discussion of future plans. Hendricks explained. The more participants we can get on record, the better. And if they suspect something, Catherine pressed, we'll have agents positioned throughout the venue, Keller assured her, including Natalie, who will be attending as a representative of the firm. At the first sign of trouble, we extract both of you. Richard cleared his throat. What about Thomas? He knows me too well. He'll sense something's off. That's where Mrs. Adler comes in, Natalie said. Your attendance together, appearing to be reconciling after your recent disagreement, provides perfect cover. Mitchell will be focused on Catherine's presence, wondering what she knows and how much of a threat she poses. You're using me as a distraction, Catherine realized. A strategic asset, Keller corrected diplomatically. Your professional reputation in design circles makes your attendance at an architectural gala completely natural. And your recent discovery of the Phoenix documents gives you motivation to stay close to Richard, whether to monitor him or reconcile is for Mitchell to wonder about. For the next hour, they rehearsed various scenarios, what to say if questioned directly, how to guide conversations toward incriminating topics, emergency extraction protocols. The technicians fitted their recording devices, testing the audio quality and camera angles. Remember, Hendricks emphasized, we need them to incriminate themselves. Don't directly accuse anyone of anything. Let them talk. The more comfortable they feel, the more likely they are to reveal details. As the briefing concluded, Catherine found herself alone with Richard for the first time since their FBI interviews began. I'm sorry you're involved in this, he said quietly. This was never what I wanted. Catherine studied him, the man she'd built a life with, whose secrets had nearly destroyed that life. What did you want? Richard, when did all of this start going wrong? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. The gambling started about 3 years ago. High-stakes poker games with clients. At first, it was just business development, a way to build relationships. Then it became something else, an escape, maybe, from the pressure of always being Richard Adler, respected attorney, perfect husband. You could have talked to me, Catherine said, hurt creeping into her voice despite her efforts to remain detached. I was ashamed, Richard admitted. You've always been so together, your business thriving, your art taking off, Rebecca doing brilliantly in school. I felt like I was standing still while you were all moving forward. He gave a bitter laugh. Pathetic, right middle-aged man having a crisis. Catherine felt a complicated mixture of anger and compassion. So, instead of talking to me, you gambled away our security and got involved with criminals. I never meant for any of that to happen, Richard said, his voice cracking slightly. By the time I realized how deep I was, Thomas already had leverage over me. Then the FBI approached me through Natalie, and I saw a way out, a way to fix what I'd broken. And the divorce papers, the prenup changes. Richard met her gaze directly. Mitchell insisted on the divorce plan. He wanted to ensure that if anything went wrong, you couldn't access any information about Phoenix through our marriage. The prenup adjustments were his idea, too designed to intimidate you into accepting a quick, quiet settlement. And you went along with it, Catherine said flatly. I fought it at first, Richard insisted. But when Mitchell threatened to involve you directly, I decided a divorce where you hated me was better than you being pulled into their world. He paused. I never planned to actually go through with the financial terms. Catherine, I had a separate account set up in your name that Mitchell didn't know about. Catherine shook her head. Too many emotions competing for dominance. I don't know what to believe anymore. Richard, believe that I'm sorry, he said simply, and that whatever happens tonight, I'm going to make this right for you, for the community they've been destroying, for everyone hurt by this scheme. Before Catherine could respond, Hendricks returned. Cars ready to take you back to your apartment. Mrs. Adler, you'll need to prepare for tonight. Another team will collect you at 6:30. As Catherine gathered her things, Richard caught her hand. Catherine, be careful tonight. If anything feels wrong, anything at all, use that panic button. Don't try to be brave. The genuine concern in his eyes reminded her of the man she'd fallen in love with, the man who might still exist beneath the lies and mistakes. You too, she replied softly. I haven't decided if I'm going to forgive you yet, but I'd like you to stay alive long enough for me to figure it out. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. I'll do my best. The Chicago Cultural Center glowed against the twilight sky, its historic facade illuminated for the Architectural Foundation's annual gala. Rain had cleared, leaving the spring evening crisp and clear as Catherine ascended the grand staircase on Richard's arm, her emerald evening gown catching the light. To any observer, they appeared to be what they had always been, a power couple navigating Chicago's social scene with practiced ease. Only Catherine was aware of the diamond earrings weight, the tension in Richard's hand at her elbow, and the FBI agents scattered throughout the crowd. "Remember," Richard murmured as they approached the entrance, "natural and relaxed. Mitchell will be watching for any signs of discomfort between us." Catherine squeezed his arm in acknowledgement, her professional smile firmly in place. 15 years of attending your firm's events has prepared me well for pretending everything is fine. Richard winced slightly at the barb, but maintained his composure as they handed their invitation to the attendant. The Cultural Center's Preston Bradley Hall took Catherine's breath away. Despite the circumstances, its magnificent Tiffany dome ceiling casting an ethereal glow over the gathering of Chicago's elite. Architects, developers, city officials, and benefactors mingled beneath the mosaic surface, champagne flowing freely. Richard, Catherine, Thomas Mitchell's voice carried across the room as he approached, martini in hand. "I'm delighted you both could make it." His smile was perfect, his tuxedo impeccable, but Catherine noted the calculation behind his eyes as they swept over her and Richard. "Thomas," Richard greeted him with a firm handshake. "Wouldn't miss it." "The Foundation's work is too important." "Indeed," Thomas agreed, turning his attention to Catherine. "And how are you, my dear, recovered from your accident with the falling books?" The reference to her bruised shoulder, the result of Richard pushing her during their confrontation, was deliberate, designed to create tension. "Completely," Catherine replied smoothly, "though I've become more careful about which shelves I reach for." Thomas's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Wise. Some things are better left untouched." He gestured to Richard. "I was surprised to see you together tonight. Given recent conversations, we're working through some things," Richard said, his hand finding Catherine's. 15 years of marriage isn't something you discard lightly." "How admirable," Thomas remarked, his tone suggesting anything but admiration. "Speaking of commitments, our friends are expecting us at 9, the Memorial Hall, as planned." "We'll be there," Richard assured him. Thomas nodded, his gaze lingering on Catherine. "Will your wife be joining us?" "Of course," Richard replied before Catherine could speak. Catherine's insights on the architectural aspects of Phoenix could be valuable. A flash of surprise crossed Thomas's features, quickly masked. "How progressive of you. Very well. 9 o'clock." With a slight bow, he moved away to greet other guests. "He's suspicious," Catherine whispered once Thomas was out of earshot. "Yes," Richard agreed. "But curious enough to let you attend the meeting? That's what we needed." They circulated through the room, maintaining their social facade while scanning for key players. Catherine spotted Natalie across the hall, elegantly dressed and engaged in conversation with city officials. Their eyes met briefly, Natalie giving an almost imperceptible nod. "Victor Salvatore just arrived," Richard murmured, guiding Catherine toward the champagne table. 3 o'clock, by the main entrance. Catherine glanced casually in that direction. Salvatore cut an imposing figure in his tuxedo, the tattoo on his neck concealed by his collar. He was accompanied by 2 men who, despite their formal attire, had the unmistakable bearing of security personnel. "He's seen us," Richard noted, his grip on Catherine's waist tightening slightly. Salvatore raised his glass in their direction, his expression unreadable. Catherine returned the gesture with practiced poise, years of gallery openings and firm events serving her well. "Mrs. Adler, what a pleasure." Catherine turned to find Gloria Adler, Richard's mother, approaching with elegant determination. At 70, Gloria remained a striking presence, silver hair perfectly coiffed, her movements graceful despite her age. "Gloria," Catherine embraced her mother-in-law warmly. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight." "Last-minute invitation," Gloria explained, kissing Richard's cheek. "The foundation is honoring Edward's work on the Riverside renovation." Edward, Richard's late father, had been a respected architect before his death 10 years earlier. Richard's surprise seemed genuine. "Mother, I'm not sure this is the best night for—" "Nonsense," Gloria interrupted, linking her arm through Catherine's. "I haven't seen my daughter-in-law in weeks. You'll excuse us for a moment, won't you? Richard Lady's room." Before Richard could protest, Gloria was guiding Catherine through the crowd toward the grand hallway. Once safely out of earshot, the older woman's demeanor changed. "That FBI agent Hendricks visited me this morning," she said without preamble. "She told me about Richard's gambling, the Phoenix situation, Not everything, I suspect, but enough. Catherine stared at her mother-in-law in shock. Gloria, no need to pretend with me, dear, Gloria said, patting her hand. I've known something was wrong for months. Richard has his father's tells when he's in trouble. She glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. I'm here to help. Help how? Catherine asked carefully. I know these people, Catherine, the old Chicago families, the money, the connections. Gloria's eyes, so like Richard's, were sharp with intelligence. I've been watching Thomas Mitchell for years. He was Edward's protege once, before the law firm, before he changed. Catherine processed this unexpected development. The FBI didn't mention you were involved? They don't know everything I know, Gloria replied with a small smile. Like the fact that Thomas Mitchell has been embezzling from his own firm for years, or that he has a rather extensive collection of properties purchased through shell companies, including a hunting lodge in Michigan where he meets with certain Eastern European gentlemen. How do you know all this? Catherine asked, amazed. Edward kept files, Gloria explained. After he died, I continued his habit of documenting Thomas's activities. Call it a widow's project, if you will. When Richard joined the firm, I hoped to protect him from Thomas's influence. Her expression softened with regret. I failed in that, it seems. Catherine's mind raced with the implications. Gloria, the FBI has a plan for tonight. Richard and I are wearing wires. I suspected as much. Gloria nodded. Those earrings are lovely, but not your usual style. She straightened. Decision made. I'll create a distraction if needed. 9 o'clock in the Memorial Hall. Yes, I overheard Thomas mentioning it. This could be dangerous, Catherine cautioned. Gloria's smile turned steely. My dear, I've been navigating Chicago society for 50 years. Dangerous men in expensive suits don't frighten me. She squeezed Catherine's hand. Now, let's return before Richard sends a search party. As they made their way back to the main hall, Catherine felt a renewed sense of determination. Gloria's unexpected alliance added another layer to their operation, one that even the FBI hadn't anticipated. Richard was engaged in conversation with several Foundation board members when they returned, his expression relaxing slightly at the sight of them. Everything all right? He asked as Catherine rejoined him. Perfect, she replied, the diamond earrings suddenly feeling lighter. Your mother was just catching me up on family news. The next hour passed in a blur of social niceties and strategic positioning. Catherine kept Salvatore in her peripheral vision, while Richard maintained casual contact with Thomas, ensuring their presence at the 9 o'clock meeting remained expected. At 8:45, Richard guided Catherine toward a quieter corner of the hall. Almost time, he murmured, straightening his tie clip the hidden camera. Are you ready for this? Catherine nodded, adjusting one of her earrings in a prearranged signal to the FBI team. As ready as I'll ever be. Catherine, Richard said, his voice dropping to ensure only she could hear. If anything goes wrong in there, anything at all, I want you to use that panic button and get out. Don't worry about me or the operation. Just get yourself to safety. The genuine concern in his eyes touched something in Catherine that she'd been trying to keep walled off the connection that 15 years of marriage had built, damaged, but not entirely destroyed by recent events. We go in together. We come out together, she replied firmly. I didn't wear this uncomfortable dress and these heavy earrings to abandon the mission at the first sign of trouble. A ghost of a smile crossed Richard's face. Always stubborn. You used to call it determined, she reminded him. I still do, he said softly. Thomas Mitchell appeared beside them, breaking the moment. It's time, he said simply, gesturing toward the corridor leading to the Memorial Hall. As they followed him through the Cultural Center's grand hallways, Catherine spotted Natalie discreetly trailing several paces behind. FBI agents positioned as servers and security personnel established visual contact as they passed. The Memorial Hall, with its elaborate marble and bronze decorations honoring Civil War veterans, had been closed to general gala attendees. Two men Catherine recognized as Salvatore's security detail flanked the entrance, admitting them with curt nods. Inside, a group had already assembled around a large circular table. Victor Salvatore sat at what was clearly the position of authority. Flanked by three men, Catherine didn't recognize their expensive suits and watchful eyes marking them as likely financial backers of the Phoenix Project. Ah, Richard, Salvatore acknowledged their entrance, and Mrs. Adler. How unexpected. Catherine has valuable insights on the architectural and design elements of Phoenix, Thomas explained smoothly. Richard thought her presence would be beneficial. Salvatore's gaze lingered on Catherine, assessing, Of course, please, join us. As they took their seats, Catherine noted the detailed model of the Phoenix development at the center of the table, a gleaming complex of glass and steel towers that would replace the historic buildings of her mother's old neighborhood. We were just discussing the timeline adjustments, Thomas continued, opening a leather portfolio. With the recent incident at the Art Center, community resistance has decreased significantly. Incident, Catherine couldn't help interjecting, her voice carefully controlled. You mean the fire? The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. Unfortunate occurrence, one of the unknown men commented in a faint Eastern European accent. But sometimes progress requires clearing away the old to make room for the new. Exactly right, Mr. Petrov, Thomas agreed. And now, with the remaining properties secured, we can move forward with phase 2 of the development. Richard leaned forward slightly. All the properties are secured. What about the Sullivan building on Archer Avenue? The owner was still holding out last I heard. Thomas and Salvatore exchanged glances. That situation has been resolved, Salvatore replied. Mr. Chen was persuaded that selling was in his best interest. Dr. Chen, Catherine asked, her heart racing at the familiar name. The owner of the tea house. You know him? Salvatore asked sharply. Catherine knows the neighborhood well, Richard interjected smoothly. Her mother grew up there. She's simply concerned about the historical preservation aspects. Thomas waved dismissively. Historical preservation is a luxury we cannot afford in this development. The returns projected for our investors require maximum density. Speaking of returns, the man called Petrov said, I am concerned about the increased attention from regulatory bodies. My associates require assurance that our involvement remains confidential. Absolutely guaranteed, Thomas assured him. Our structure of shell companies and offshore accounts is impenetrable. The funds move through 6 different jurisdictions before reaching the Development Corporation. And the recent media inquiries? Salvatore pressed. The Tribune article mentioned federal interest in foreign real estate investments. Thomas dismissed this with a confident gesture. Standard regulatory posturing. Nothing connected to Phoenix specifically. Our sources in the federal offices confirm no active investigations into our operation. Catherine fought to keep her expression neutral, aware of the recording devices capturing every word. Beside her, Richard maintained his professional demeanor, though she could sense his tension. Nevertheless, Salvatore continued, perhaps we should accelerate the timeline, break ground next month rather than waiting until fall. Once construction begins, the money becomes much harder to trace. I agree. Petrov nodded. My associates are becoming anxious. The sooner their investment shows visible progress, the better. What about the environmental impact study? Richard asked. The EPA requirements have been handled, Thomas interrupted smoothly. Judge Warren has agreed to expedite the approvals. A generous donation to his re-election campaign proved persuasive. Catherine felt a chill at the casual mention of judicial corruption. The scope of the Phoenix scheme was even broader than they'd suspected, reaching into government offices and regulatory agencies. Now, Salvatore said, turning his attention fully to Catherine, I'm curious. Mrs. Adler, what exactly is your interest in this project beyond your husband's involvement? Of course. All eyes turned to her, the atmosphere in the room shifting subtly. Catherine called on years of client presentations to maintain her composure. As Richard mentioned, I grew up hearing my mother's stories about this neighborhood. It has historical significance that could actually enhance the development's value if incorporated thoughtfully. She gestured to the model. For instance, the Sullivan Building's facade could be preserved as part of the commercial entrance, creating a unique identity for the project. Salvatore studied her, his expression unreadable. Interesting perspective. However, I wonder if there might be another reason for your sudden involvement. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small object that made Catherine's blood run cold, the USB drive she had taken from Richard's safe. This was recovered from your home yesterday, Salvatore continued, placing the drive on the table. It contains rather sensitive information about our project. Richard stiffened beside her. Victor. No, Richard. Salvatore cut him off. I'd like to hear from your wife. Did you examine the contents of this drive? Mrs. Adler. Catherine's mind raced. Denial would be pointless. Affirmation potentially dangerous. The diamond earrings felt suddenly heavy. The panic button a tempting option. I glanced at it, she admitted, deciding a partial truth was safest. I didn't understand most of the financial details. My concern was primarily with the architectural aspects affecting the neighborhood. I see. Salvatore nodded, seemingly satisfied. And you didn't share this information with anyone? No authorities, perhaps. Who would I share it with? Catherine countered, maintaining eye contact. As I said, The financial structures are beyond my expertise. I was more interested in the development plans themselves. A tense silence followed, broken by the unexpected opening of the Memorial Hall doors. Gloria Adler entered, apologetic smile in place. "Oh, I'm so sorry to interrupt," she exclaimed with perfect social grace. "I was told the Foundation Board was meeting here to discuss the award presentation." "Mrs. Adler," Thomas rose, surprise evident in his voice. "This is a private meeting." "Thomas Mitchell," Gloria acknowledged coolly. "It's been some time. Not since Edward's funeral, I believe." She turned to Salvatore. "Victor Salvatore, isn't it I remember you from the Zoning Commission hearings last year? Such a passionate advocate for development, regardless of community impact." Catherine marveled at her mother-in-law's composure and strategic interruption. Gloria's presence had immediately altered the room's dynamic, diffusing the tension around the USB drive. "Gloria," Richard stood. "The board meeting is in the East Wing. Let me escort you." "No need, dear." Gloria waved him off. "I can find my way. Do finish your meeting." She cast a meaningful glance around the table. "Though I must say, it's interesting to see Mr. Petrov here. Edward always said to watch carefully when certain European interests became involved in Chicago real estate." Petrov shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "You know of me, madam. My late husband kept extensive records," Gloria replied with a pleasant smile that didn't reach her eyes. "A habit I've continued. Now, if you'll excuse my interruption." As Gloria departed, Catherine caught the subtle nod she directed at the hallway, a signal that something was happening outside. Salvatore returned his attention to the table, his earlier suspicion now mixed with unease. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion another time." The gala crowd. He was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway, raised voices, and the sound of approaching footsteps. Thomas moved quickly to the door, opening it to find Agent Hendricks flanked by several FBI agents. Credentials displayed. "Thomas Mitchell," Hendricks asked formally, "we have a warrant to search these premises and seize documents related to the Phoenix Development Project." The room erupted in controlled chaos. Petrov and his associates rose abruptly, looking for exits. Salvatore remained seated, his expression hardening as he looked directly at Richard and Catherine. "You," he said simply, understanding dawning. "How long have you been working with them?" Before either could respond, FBI agents flooded the room. Federal agents, everyone remained seated. Hendricks approached the table, retrieving the USB drive Salvatore had placed there. "Thank you for gathering everyone together. Mr. Salvatore, it's made our job much easier." As agents began reading rights and securing the room, Catherine felt Richard's hand find hers beneath the table. She squeezed it instinctively, not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement of what they'd accomplished together. "You both did well." Natalie appeared beside them, her FBI credentials now visible on a chain around her neck. "The recording devices captured everything we needed." "Gloria," Catherine said urgently, "is she safe?" "Your mother-in-law is with agents in the hallway," Natalie assured her. "Quite a remarkable woman. She approached Agent Keller directly at the beginning of the evening, offering her assistance." Richard shook his head in amazement. "That sounds like Mother." They watched as Thomas Mitchell was handcuffed and led from the room, his once confident demeanor shattered. Salvatore followed, his expression betraying nothing as he passed them. "It's over," Richard said quietly. "Finally over." But as Catherine watched the operation unfold around them, she knew some things were just beginning the process of rebuilding what had been broken, of determining what could be salvaged from the wreckage of trust and the foundation of 15 years together. That would be a different kind of endgame altogether. 3 weeks after the gala, Catherine sat in the sunlit conference room of the U.S. Attorney's Office, reviewing her testimony for the upcoming grand jury proceeding. The Phoenix case had expanded far beyond their initial expectations, ensnaring city officials, judges, and financial institutions in its widening net. "Your statement looks complete," Mrs. Adler, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jordan Martinez said, collecting the documents. "The grand jury convenes next Tuesday, but with the evidence we've gathered, including the recordings from the Memorial Hall meeting, indictments are virtually guaranteed." "What about Richard's situation?" Catherine asked, the question that had been foremost in her mind throughout the process. Martinez exchanged glances with Agent Hendricks, who had been overseeing the case. "Given his cooperation and the evidence he provided, we've recommended a deal: full immunity from prosecution in exchange for his continued testimony against Mitchell, Salvatore, and the others." Relief washed through Catherine. Despite the complicated feelings she harbored toward her husband, the prospect of him facing criminal charges had weighed heavily on her. "There will be professional consequences, of course," Martinez continued. The Bar Association has opened an ethics investigation, which will likely result in suspension of his license, possibly disbarment. He knows, Catherine nodded. Richard had been preparing for this eventuality. His legal career another casualty of his poor choices. One more thing, Hendricks added, sliding a folder across the table. As promised, we've been working with the city regarding the properties in the Phoenix development area. These are the preliminary plans for rebuilding the Arts Center, incorporating a community development trust to prevent similar land grabs in the future. Catherine opened the folder to find architectural renderings of a rebuilt arts center larger than the original, with expanded facilities for community programs. This is more than I expected. The seized assets from the Phoenix investors are substantial, Martinez explained. The court approved using a portion for community restitution. Your advocacy made a difference, Mrs. Adler. As Catherine left the federal building, spring sunshine warming her face, she felt a chapter closing. The Phoenix case would continue through the courts for months, but her active role was diminishing. Now she faced the more personal aftermath, deciding what remained of her marriage and how to move forward. Richard had been staying at his mother's Lake Forest home since the night of the gala, giving Catherine space while remaining available whenever she wanted to talk. They'd had several careful conversations, primarily focused on practical matters, financial arrangements, the house, communications with Rebecca. Their daughter had flown home from Paris after being told a carefully edited version of events. At 20, Rebecca possessed her mother's perceptiveness and her father's determination, processing the family crisis with surprising maturity. He made terrible mistakes, Mom, she'd said during a private moment. But he's still Dad, still the man who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with calculus and cried at my high school graduation. Catherine's phone chimed with a message as she reached her car, Eleanor, checking in as she had daily since the operation. Art Center Board meeting confirmed for tomorrow. Ready to discuss your vision for the new space. Eleanor had thrown herself into the rebuilding efforts, leveraging her gallery connections to secure donations for the center's arts programs. It gave Catherine a focus beyond her personal turmoil, a way to create something positive from the ashes of Phoenix. Another message appeared. Richard, Mother mentioned you're stopping by this afternoon to pick up those books. I can make myself scarce if you prefer. Catherine stared at the screen, considering they needed to really talk sooner or later. No need, she typed back. I'll see you then. Gloria's Lake Forest estate sat on 3 manicured acres overlooking the water. Its Georgian architecture a testament to old Chicago money and understated elegance. Catherine had always loved visiting, finding peace in the gardens Gloria tended with passionate expertise. Gloria greeted her with a warm embrace at the door. Perfect timing, Desiz, dear. I've just made tea. They settled in the solarium, spring flowers visible through the windows. Richard's in the library, Gloria said, pouring tea into delicate cups. He's been organizing Edward's papers. All those records about Thomas Mitchell are proving quite useful to the prosecution. How is he? Catherine asked, the question carrying more weight than its simplicity suggested. Gloria considered carefully before answering. Humbled, determined to make amends, afraid of losing what matters most to him. She met Catherine's gaze directly. And missing you terribly. Though he won't say it, I'm still angry, Catherine admitted, cupping her hands around the warm teacup. Not just about the gambling or the Phoenix mess, but the lying month after month of deception while I thought everything was fine. As you should be, Gloria agreed surprisingly. Edward did something similar in the early years of our marriage, not gambling, but a business venture he hid from me that nearly bankrupted us. I didn't speak to him for 6 weeks. What changed? Catherine asked. I realized something important, that I was judging him against an impossible standard of perfection, rather than accepting him as the flawed, complicated man he actually was. Gloria's eyes, so like Richard's, held wisdom born of experience, not to excuse his behavior, but to understand it. And you forgave him, eventually, on my terms, with new boundaries clearly established. Gloria reached across to pat Catherine's hand. But your situation is your own, dear. Only you can decide what's right for you. After finishing their tea, Catherine made her way to the library, a 2-story room lined with books that had been Edward's sanctuary and now served as Richard's temporary office. He stood at the large desk, sorting through files, looking up when she entered. Catherine? He greeted her, nervous energy evident in his movements. The art books you wanted are over here. She approached the desk, noting the changes in him over the past weeks. He'd lost weight, and silver dominated his once salt and pepper hair. But his eyes were clearer than they'd been in months, the haunted look of a man with dangerous secrets replaced by something more open, if uncertain. "Thank you for collecting them," she said, running her fingers along the spines of the rare art volumes they'd acquired together over the years. "Rebecca might need them for her thesis research." "How is she?" Richard asked, hunger for information about their daughter evident in his voice. "Good, determined to finish the semester despite everything. She's her father's daughter that way." Catherine offered the small connection like an olive branch. Richard accepted it with a careful smile. "And her mother's talent. I saw the portfolio she brought home. Her work is extraordinary." An awkward silence fell between them. 15 years of comfortable intimacy replaced by cautious distance. "Martinez told me about the immunity deal," Catherine finally said. "That's good news. Better than I deserve," Richard acknowledged, "though the Bar Association will likely have a different perspective. What will you do if you can't practice law?" He shrugged slightly. "I've been thinking about teaching. Northwestern has a legal ethics program that might benefit from someone who's learned the hard way." He gestured to the files spread across the desk. "And there's Mother's project documenting corruption in Chicago development. Turns out I have some expertise in that area now." Catherine nodded, appreciating that he wasn't wallowing in self-pity. "The art center is being rebuilt, larger than before, with expanded community programs. I saw the plans. Your influence is evident in the design." Richard hesitated, then continued. "Catherine, I know I have no right to ask this, but where do we stand, you and I?" The direct question caught her off guard, though she'd been expecting it eventually. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "Some days I'm so angry I can barely think straight. Other days I remember the 15 years before all this and wonder if there's something worth salvaging." Richard accepted this with a nod. "I understand. For what it's worth, I've started seeing a therapist, trying to understand why I made the choices I did, why I couldn't just talk to you about the gambling before everything spiraled." "That's good," Catherine said, genuine approval in her voice. "I've been talking to someone too, about trust, about whether it can be rebuilt once broken." "Can it?" Richard asked softly. "I don't know yet," she repeated, "but I'm trying to find out." He seemed to gather courage before speaking again. Would you, would you have dinner with me sometime, not here, not at home? Neutral territory, just to talk." Catherine considered the request. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't a promise of reconciliation, just a meal, a conversation, a step toward whatever came next. Yes, she decided. Dinner would be okay. Relief washed across his features. "Thank you." As Catherine gathered the art books, a document on Richard's desk caught her eye. Architectural plans for a building she recognized. "Is that the Sullivan Building? The tea house on Archer Avenue?" Richard nodded. "Dr. Michael Chen's place. Turns out he's Eleanor's brother, the same Michael Chen who helped you analyze the USB drive contents that first day." "What?" Catherine stared in shock. "Michael owns the tea house. Why didn't he say anything?" "According to the FBI investigation, he was working with them already, monitoring Phoenix's attempts to buy the property. When you came to Eleanor with the USB drive, he recognized the connection, but couldn't reveal his involvement without compromising the investigation." Catherine shook her head, processing this new information. "So, when Salvatore said at the meeting that Chen had been persuaded to sell, he was lying," Richard confirmed. "Michael never sold, never intended to. He was the FBI's original way into the Phoenix operation." The revelation reminded Catherine how multi-layered the entire situation had been, everyone playing roles, holding secrets, revealing only portions of the truth. "I should go," she said, gathering the books. "I'm meeting Eleanor to discuss the art center renovation." Richard walked her to the door. "Catherine," he said as she was leaving, "whatever you decide about us, know that I'm proud of you for your courage that night at the gala, for everything you're doing with the art center, for how you've handled all of this with Rebecca." The simple sincerity in his voice touched something in Catherine that had remained walled off since discovering his betrayal. Not enough to erase the hurt, but perhaps enough to consider a path forward. "I'll call you about dinner," she promised. 6 months later, Catherine stood in the center of the nearly completed arts center, morning light streaming through the skylights she'd insisted on in the redesign. Around her, construction workers put finishing touches on the space that would soon host its grand reopening. "The acoustics in the performance area are perfect," Eleanor said, joining her. "The engineers finally got the sound baffling right." Catherine nodded, satisfaction warming her as she surveyed what they'd accomplished. The rebuilt center had expanded to include not just art studios, but music spaces, a small theater, and community meeting rooms. More importantly, it anchored a revitalized neighborhood plan that preserved historic buildings while allowing for thoughtful development. The Sullivan Building renovation starts next month, Eleanor continued, consulting her tablet. Michael's tea house will remain on the ground floor, with artist lofts above. Speaking of Michael, Catherine said, I still can't believe he never mentioned his connection to all this. Eleanor smiled apologetically. FBI instructions, though he did push me to introduce you to Andrew Morrison when you needed help. She glanced at her watch. The board meeting starts in 20 minutes. Ready to present the final programming schedule. Catherine nodded, gathering her presentation materials. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of activity testifying before the grand jury, working with architects on the center's redesign, establishing the community trust that would manage the property. The work had been therapeutic, giving her purpose while she navigated the personal aftermath of the Phoenix case. Thomas Mitchell had accepted a plea deal, providing evidence against Victor Salvatore and the Eastern European investors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Salvatore was fighting the charges, but with multiple witnesses now cooperating, his conviction seemed inevitable. As for Richard, they had been taking cautious steps toward reconciliation. Weekly dinners had evolved into tentative discussions about their future, each conversation rebuilding a small measure of trust. Richard had accepted a teaching position at Northwestern Law School, lecturing on ethics and professional responsibility, finding purpose in using his mistakes as lessons for future attorneys. Catherine, Eleanor interrupted her thoughts. There's something you should know before the meeting. Richard's here. Here? Why? The Education Committee invited him to discuss the legal aid clinic he's proposing to house in the center. I thought you knew. Catherine shook her head. We had dinner last night. He never mentioned it. Do you want me to ask him to reschedule? No, Catherine decided after a moment's consideration. It's fine. The center is bigger than our personal situation. They found Richard in the main conference room, discussing something with Michael Chen. He looked up when Catherine entered, surprise and uncertainty crossing his features. Catherine, I didn't realize you'd be here today. I'm presenting the programming schedule, she replied, keeping her tone professional. Eleanor mentioned you're proposing a legal aid clinic. Richard nodded, relaxing slightly. For residents fighting predatory development and housing issues, pro bono work from law students under faculty supervision, that would be valuable to the community, Catherine acknowledged, genuinely impressed by the initiative. The board meeting proceeded smoothly, with Catherine's programming proposal receiving unanimous approval. Richard's legal clinic concept generated enthusiastic support, particularly when he explained it would be named in honor of Dr. Chen's father, who had fought similar development battles in the neighborhood decades earlier. After the meeting, Catherine found herself alone with Richard in the center's future gallery space. You didn't mention the clinic proposal last night, she said, not accusatory but curious. I wasn't sure how you'd feel about it, Richard admitted. This has been your project from the beginning. I didn't want you to think I was intruding. It's a good idea, Catherine replied honestly. The neighborhood needs exactly that kind of resource. Richard studied her for a moment. Thank you. That means a lot, coming from you. They walked together through the space that would soon be filled with artwork, their footsteps echoing on the newly finished floors. Rebecca called yesterday, Richard said. She's been accepted to that summer program at the Sorbonne. She told me. Catherine smiled. She's thrilled. She also asked if we'd both come to Paris to visit her afterward. Richard hesitated. Together? Catherine stopped walking, turning to face him directly. What did you tell her? That I'd like that very much, but it was up to you. His expression was open, vulnerable. No pressure, Catherine. She'll understand either way. 6 months ago, the idea of traveling with Richard would have been unthinkable. Now, after countless difficult conversations, therapy sessions, and gradual steps forward, it didn't seem impossible. I'd like to visit her, Catherine said carefully, and I think doing it together would make her happy. Relief and cautious hope crossed Richard's features. It would, very much. They continued their tour of the center, conversation shifting to practical matters, the opening gala, board responsibilities, funding for Year 2 programs. The easy professional rapport they'd always shared remained intact, a foundation upon which other aspects of their relationship might eventually be rebuilt. As they reached the main entrance, Catherine's phone chimed with a message from the contractor about a last-minute design change. I should handle this, she said, checking the details. It's about the donor wall installation. Of course, Richard nodded. I have class in an hour anyway. He hesitated, then added, dinner on Friday. There's a new place on Randolph Street that's supposed to be excellent. Friday works, Catherine agreed. Then, making a decision that had been forming for weeks, she added, actually, why don't you come to the house? I'll cook. Richard looked surprised. The house, are you sure? Since the night of her birthday party, Richard hadn't set foot in their home. Catherine had remained there alone. the space gradually transforming as she redecorated, reclaiming it as her own. I'm sure, she said simply. It's time. That evening, Catherine stood in what had once been Richard's study, now transformed into her studio. The mahogany desk had been replaced by a large work table, the law books by art references, the dark wood paneling painted a light, airy blue. On the easel before her sat her latest work nearly complete after months of evolution. What had begun as shadowy figures in darkness had transformed into something more complex figures emerging from fog into clear light. Faces turned toward a dawn breaking over a city skyline. Her phone rang, Eleanor checking in, as she still did regularly. How did the board meeting go with Richard there? Her friend asked without preamble. Better than expected, Catherine replied, adding highlights to the canvas. His legal clinic proposal is actually perfect for the center. And how are you feeling about everything else? Catherine considered the question, brush poised. I invited him to dinner at the house on Friday. A moment of surprised silence. That's a big step, Kat. It is, Catherine agreed. But I think I'm ready for it. Not to pretend nothing happened, but to see if we can build something new from what remains. Do you still love him? Eleanor asked quietly. Yes, Catherine admitted, the truth she'd been acknowledging gradually over the past months. Not in the same way as before that's gone. But there's something else now, something that survived the worst and might be stronger for it. After finishing the call, Catherine returned to her painting, adding final touches to the cityscape. The work had become a visual journal of her journey from betrayal and confusion through anger and resolution to this new place of tentative rebuilding. She stepped back, assessing the nearly finished canvas. Not perfect, not unblemished, but honest in its complexity. Like the path forward with Richard, uncertain but possible. Damaged, but not beyond repair, Catherine set down her brush, a sense of completion settling over her. Tomorrow would bring more work at the Art Center, more testimony preparations, more steps in the careful reconstruction of her life. But tonight, in this transformed space that was wholly hers, she had created something new from the ruins of what had been lost. And that, perhaps, was the most important foundation of all. Sunlight filters through the skylight of the rebuilt art center, illuminating the woman standing alone before her canvas. Brush suspended mid-stroke. They say you never truly know someone until you've seen them at their worst. 15 years of marriage, and I thought I knew every shadow in Richard's heart. I was wrong. The man who betrayed me with divorce papers on my birthday became the same man who risked everything to make amends. Chicago winters teach you something about endurance, how beauty can emerge from the harshest conditions, how foundations thought broken can sometimes be rebuilt stronger, not perfectly, not without scars, but perhaps with greater honesty than before. Trust, once shattered, never quite returns the same way. Like a mended vase, you always see the lines where it broke, but there's a certain grace in accepting imperfection, in building something new from what remains rather than pretending the cracks don't exist. I look at our home now, transformed, rearranged, mine in a way it never was before. The gallery walls display paintings born from betrayal, but finished in tentative hope. When someone tries to erase you from your own story, perhaps the most powerful response isn't fury or revenge, but simply refusing to disappear. And sometimes, in that defiance, you discover who you truly are. The brush finally touches canvas, adding light to darkness,